Welcome to Tanya, a roadmap to the inner you. There's a lot of news about Iran. So I want to tell a story, a true story about the Tanya and Iran. The Tanya being the central work, the fundamental work of Hasidic philosophy, was promoted very much by all the Chabad Rebbes, all the Chabad leaders, and especially by our Rabba, who asked that they should publish a copy of the Tanya in every area in the world where there are Jews. To date, there are, I think, around 8,000 editions.
Even in Buffalo?
Even in Buffalo, yes. Maybe if we can get a hold of some of the copies. Oh, maybe we can give it to everyone here if we can find where the copies are. At any rate, one of the places where the Rebbe wanted the Tanya should be printed and was printed was a city called Tehran, under the Shah. This is before the revolution, but it was right before the revolution. So the Tanya was printed and brought to the Jewish Center. I don't know what it's called. It was the Central Jewish Institution, and there was not enough time to do anything with the books because the revolution occurred and there was just chaos and upheaval. So they left the Tanyas on the floor of the library, piled up. They printed a few hundred copies, and it was all piled up because the idea was to distribute it, but they didn't have a chance to do that. And then the revolution occurs, and Khomeini's government issues a decree that everyone who has any type of memorabilia or any artifacts from the Shah and previous Persian governments that were obviously not part of the Shia revolution should be eliminated, should be gotten rid of. You were not allowed to have any vestige of the past in your organization. Now, the Jewish community was very privileged that it had a very good relationship with the Shah and with previous administrations, and they had tons of artifacts some of them were very precious, were historical. So they didn't know what to do. To get rid of a historical artifact was something that they loathed to do. On the other hand, their lives were in danger. Who knows what they can do? But they tarried. They tarried and tarried, and they didn't get rid of it. 30 days go by, and they have two guests at the entrance, a knock on the door, ring the bell, two agents from Khomeini's government, and we're here to inspect your facility to see if you have anything left from the previous administration. The rabbi there was ready to get his shrouds for burial because he knew that this was the end, because they were ruthless. And as you see what's going on today, how ruthless they are. So they come in, and the first room they go into is the library. And then they look at the library, and they see books piled on the ground, which is an unusual place to put books in a library. So they asked, what is this book? They took a copy, they opened it up randomly, gave it to the rabbi, and says, tell us what it says here. It happened to be the second part of the Tanya, and the second part of the Tanya's thesis is the idea that God is everything, that God's creation of the universe is a continuous process, and therefore the whole energy of the world is God's presence, without which the world would revert to nothingness. That's the theme, and he was explaining in Persian, in Farsi, whatever the language is called, and they were listening. And one of them takes the book back from the rabbi, closes it, reverently, gives it a kiss, and puts it back on the pile. And he says, a place that teaches things like this did not have to be inspected. And they turned around to leave. And the rabbi says, please, before you leave, could you put it in writing that you inspected us? We don't want to have other inspectors coming and harassing us again. And they did that. And the Jewish community was saved by the Tanya. This is a true story. When it happened, I remember it was reported. Just to tell you another Iranian story, I don't remember how much after the hostages were taken, the American hostages in the American embassy, but they were trying to get, and America was trying to get clergy to come to visit the hostages, to help them, to give them some moral support and religious inspiration. And the Iranians resisted until it was right after Simchas Torah, they finally gave permission for America to send 3 clergymen. This sounds like a joke. A priest, a minister, and a rabbi. But this is a true story. The rabbi was Rabbi Abraham Mordechai Hershberg, the chief rabbi of Mexico. He was an incredible scholar and a very dynamic leader. And he was going to be the one. They wouldn't take anyone from America. So they took a rabbi from Mexico. And he was told they were going to go right after Simchas Torah. So he had a connection to the Rebbe. He was not a card-carrying Chabad follower, but he was very close to the Rebbe. So he consulted with the Rebbe about his trip. And the Rebbe says, take with you a Chanukah Menorah. And he was puzzled by that, because this was right after Simchas Torah, which is about 2.5 months before Chanukah. So he didn't understand, why would I take a menorah when I'm going 2 months before Chanukah? But anyhow, he didn't ask any questions. The next day, they get a call that the trip was canceled. The Iranians said, no one's going. About a week before Chanukah, the Iranian government says, okay, you can come now. So he understood why the Rebbe told him take a menorah with him. A few days before Chanukah is Yud Tes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, which is the day the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, was liberated from prison. And it was a major celebration, and the Rebbe spoke. And Rabbi Hershberg was sitting behind the Rebbe on the dais with all the other leading rabbis and elder Hasidim. And the Rebbe turns around to him in between talks, and the Rebbe says, don't lose, the Hebrew word is Gaon Yaakov, the glory of Jacob. That means don't lose your Jewish pride. And he was puzzled by that, because he's going as a rabbi. He's not going to smuggle himself in there and hide his Jewishness. He's going as a chief rabbi of Mexico, designed to cater to the spiritual and Jewish needs of the Jewish hostages. There were 3 or 4, I think, and the American hostages. But he didn't understand, but he found out what the Rebbe meant very soon after. He comes to Tehran, and he takes care of the needs of the Jewish hostages, and everything goes fine. He gives them the menorah. They were very happy to get it for Chanukah. And then he was invited to a prayer meeting in the center of Tehran. There was a big stage. Khomeini himself was standing on the stage, and the 3 guests sent by the clergy, the priest, the minister, and the rabbi. That's it on the platform. And everyone else is surrounding. How many people were there in the crowd? Small crowd, about 1 million people. And then they start the prayers, and in the middle of the prayers, Khomeini gets on his knees and bows. And 1 million Muslims get on their knees and bow. The priest gets on his knees and bows. The minister gets on his knees and his bows. And the rabbi remembered, the Rebbe told him, don't forget your Jewish pride. And he stood erect, as straight as a statue. The rabbi of Tehran was standing nearby, because he was also invited, and he was ready to get a heart attack, because if Khomeini saw the chutzpah of that rabbi, who knows what he's going to do? Sure enough, Khomeini saw. And he calls over the rabbi through one of his aides, and probably through a translator. He says to the rabbi, Rabbi, why didn't you bow down? And the rabbi says, my mother taught me that if I don't understand what the people are saying, I shouldn't bow down, something like that. So the Khomeini says, but the priest bowed down and the minister bowed down. So the rabbis, they probably understand the language. He was diplomatic, you know. So the Khomeini says, no, they were scared. You were not scared. And the rabbi saw that Khomeini was actually impressed. As evil as a man as he was impressed. And the rabbi asked, can I have a private meeting with you? And they made a meeting a few days later in the city of Qom. And then there was shooting over there while the rabbi was waiting, and Khomeini was terrified. You know, he was a big shot when he had his soldiers surrounding him, but when he was not, without protection, he wasn't such a big shot. But meanwhile, he postponed it for another day. And he asked Khomeini, I think this is what he asked him specifically. Jews would go to shul very early in the morning when it was still dark and there was a curfew. You weren't allowed to be out from a certain time at night till daybreak. And the Jews were being harassed for that. So he said, if you can help the Jews not be harassed when they go to the shul, please do that. And the Khomeini says, absolutely. He says, I have nothing against Jews who observe their religion. I'm against the ones who don't. So this is the evil Khomeini. Okay, but the main story was the Tanya story. Anyhow, we did the gist, a little bit of a summary of chapter 1 last week. So I want to go into chapter 2, but first a little bit of a summary and maybe a few more points of chapter 1. The Tanya begins, the word Tanya, as I mentioned last week, actually means we have studied, we have learned in a brisa. A brisa is a text that was excluded from the Mishnah, but was preserved in other books. And what does the brisa say? That when before a person is born, they administer an oath to the child. Tehi Tzaddik, be a righteous person. V'al tehi Rasha, but don't be a wicked person. Now the Alter Rebbe doesn't ask the question, but he answers it later on in the Tanya. It doesn't make any sense. If you tell someone, be righteous, you don't have to tell them not to be wicked, because if you're righteous, you're automatically not wicked. So there's a redundancy there. And then the brisa continues, and even if the whole world tells you you're a tzaddik, in your own eyes you should be like a Rasha, like a wicked person. And the Alter Rebbe questions that. He says, how could a person think of himself as a Rasha, as a wicked person, when it says in Ethics of the Fathers, you should not be a Rasha in your own estimation. You should not regard yourself as wicked. And furthermore, it says if a person is going to consider himself to be wicked, how could they serve God with joy? How could you be a happy person if you think of yourself as a horrible person? So it doesn't. And then on the other hand, if a person says, "I don't care if I'm wicked, I'm going to enjoy life," he won't take anything seriously. How could you tell a person to think of himself as being wicked? So there must be a deeper meaning to that. That's the opening statement of the Tanya. And I'm going to get ahead of ourselves and tell you what the answer is to the question, to both questions. The answer to the first question, be a righteous person but don't be wicked, because there are three categories. There are actually five, but the three primary categories. There's the Rasha, the guy on the bottom. There's the Tzaddik, the guy on the top, and there's the Beinoni, the one in between, the in-betweener. So the first thing you're told before you're born, you're given an oath, whatever that means. I'll try to explain it in a moment. You're given an oath, be a Tzaddik. You should try to be the highest level. But if you can't, because that may be elusive to most people, at least don't be the guy on the bottom, be the one in between. So that's how he answers that question. The second question, how could it say that you should consider yourself, if everyone tells you you're a tzaddik, you should consider yourself in your own eyes as a Rasha. And that's problematic. So the Alter Rebbe says it doesn't say you should consider yourself a Rasha, like a Rasha. Because the Beinoni is someone who shares the same struggle as the Rasha. What is a Rasha? Let's define Rasha. Rasha is a person who doesn't follow the laws, who doesn't follow the commandments. Knowingly doesn't follow the commandments. Why don't they follow it? Because I'm not talking about someone who doesn't know about it, but someone who knows about it and doesn't follow it because they're they're submitting to their desires that tell them that they want to do something that they feel interested in doing, contrary to what God wants. And they have to struggle. They go back and forth. Sometimes they win a battle, sometimes they lose the battle. The Beinoni has the same struggle. The difference between the Rasha and the Beinoni is that the Beinoni wins the battles, the Rasha loses some. So you could be a Beinoni as someone who doesn't lose any battles, but still has to struggle no less than everyone else. So that's what it means. If everyone tells you you're a tzaddik because you seem to be so perfect, in your own eyes you should recognize that no, you're not a tzaddik necessarily. You're a Beinoni. You have the same struggle. And if you think you're a tzaddik, you're not going to win your struggles. You're going to be complacent. You'll think of yourself, I'm perfect. I don't have to struggle anymore. And even though this may be true about in the full sense of the term tzaddik, in the full sense of the word Beinoni, every one of us, if you think that you conquered some aspect of your personality, that you behave the right way, don't trust in yourself that you already have perfected it. It could always come back. There's always the case, an alcoholic, for 30 years they're clean, and they take one drink and they go back to drinking. Why? Because they haven't really eradicated that desire. They just controlled it, and they controlled it so well that they were clean for who knows how many decades, which happens very often. So a person should never think that I'm beyond the level where I have to be aware of my weaknesses. You always have to be aware of your potential weaknesses. That's, in a nutshell, the way the Alter Rebbe treats these two questions. And what does it mean they give you an oath before you're born? Does it mean the fetus raises his right hand and swears? So the Hebrew word for oath is cognate, is related to another Hebrew word, which is masbia, to satiate, to feed you. Before you're born, God feeds your soul with energy to be able to fulfill the mission, to be able to fulfill those oaths, to be a tzaddik and at least not to be a Rasha. So before we're born, the fetus is given certain spiritual energy. And that's what an oath is. Why does a person make an oath? If I tell you a fact, and you say, would you swear to it? What's the difference? I told you the fact, I'm probably not going to lie to you. But when you swear to something, it gives you more energy. A person makes a commitment to do something good, and they swear they're going to do it, there's more likelihood that they will do it. Okay, so in the first chapter, he quoted, in order to understand, because here's the problem is, what's the difference between the tzaddik and the Beinoni? If they're both perfect in the sense that they do everything right, they win all their battles, then what's the difference? So it's obvious that the difference is an internal difference, not external. Externally, they're the same. You couldn't tell the difference if you saw two people and you observed their behavior for a year, and you say, these are idealistic people, these are the most perfect individuals I've ever met, they do everything right. One could be a tzaddik and one could be a Beinoni. You'll never know. It's almost impossible to know. And sometimes even people who are really tzaddik don't know it. And that's the story that Rabba, who was without any question the greatest rabbi alive in his day, said about himself, I'm an example of a Beinoni. And his student said to him, you're killing us all. If you're a Beinoni, what are we? We're as I said last week, we're chopped liver. So, how could that be understood? The Alter Rebbe asks, if a Beinoni, conventional wisdom says a Beinoni is someone who has half sins and half mitzvahs. How could Rabba think of himself as someone who did as many sins as he did mitzvahs? That's delusional. That's not humility, that's delusional. So it's obvious that the Beinoni is no different from a Tzaddik in terms externally. The differences are internal. Well, in order to understand the internal differences, you have to know what dynamic do we possess? What is our internal structure? We have two souls. That's how he starts off in chapter 1, and he discusses the animal soul, which is the first soul. And what is the animal soul? The animal soul is simply the vital soul, the soul that gives us our ability to live and the drive for everything that we want for ourselves. And it leads to all sorts of negative traits and even some positive traits. That's the animal soul. And now in chapter 2, he introduces the godly soul. Why is it called the second soul? If someone else would have been writing the Tanya, he might have started with the godly soul, start with the holy soul, and then go down to the animal soul. So the simple explanation is, your godly soul, your animal soul enters you at the time of birth. That's when or even before birth, and when you're still a fetus, that's when your animal soul, your vital soul, your animating soul enters you. Your godly soul only begins its entry at the time, for a boy at the time of the bris, when he has his circumcision, and for a girl either when she's born or when she gets her name. But it doesn't fully penetrate, it doesn't fully take over the person until you're bat or bar mitzvah. When you reach the age of bat mitzvah for a girl, the age of 12, that's when her godly soul enters fully into her being. That's why before your bat mitzvah, you're not held fully responsible, because you don't have the full complement of your godly soul. Your godly soul enters you at the age of 12 for a girl, at the age of 13 for a boy, the bar mitzvah. So that's why it's the second soul, because chronologically it comes in second. The first soul that you have is the animal soul. And in that way, in that sense, it gives the animal soul a certain advantage. That's why we struggle so much, because our godly soul is not fully developed within us, even as our animal soul is fully developed. When a child throws a tantrum, that's the animal soul. That's a wild animal. And the Torah describes a young child as a wild animal, because that's what the animal soul is. The animal soul is an animal. But when do you beget your godly soul? At the age of bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. Now, what's the definition of the godly soul? It's a part of God above. There's a verse in the book of Job that the soul is cheluk elokah mimal. It's a part of God above. And the Alter Rebbe just adds one word to that verse, mamash, really, literally, actually. That means that it's not just a figure of speech, but the godly soul is a part of God. That God gives us and enables us to achieve things that only a godly soul could achieve, which is to control the total desire of the animal soul, to tame the animal soul. The godly soul is unique. Now, the godly soul is different from everything else, because everything comes from God. The table has godly energy in it. Or as the Alter Rebbe says in that quote I mentioned before, even a rock, the Arizal says, has a soul. Because if it didn't have a soul, it wouldn't exist. If God would withdraw his energy from the rock would simply disappear. It wouldn't be destroyed, it wouldn't exist. Nothing could exist without divine energy. So what is the difference between the godly soul and all other things that have God's energy in it? So the difference is in several ways of describing it. One way of describing it is that the creation of everything in this world, the Torah describes as coming through God's speech. God said, "Let there be light." God said, "Let there be vegetation." It's God speaking. It's speech. The godly soul comes from God's thought. What does that mean? Thought is internal. When you think, it's between yourself and yourself. You're not communicating to the outside. Speech is where you're projecting your ideas to the outside. It's no longer attached to you. Thought is internal. It's within you. All other creations come from God's speech. That means, by definition, they were created in a way that God projects his energy outside of himself, as it were. From God's perspective, nothing is outside of himself, but he projects that, an energy that is beyond himself and therefore detached from himself. The godly soul is never detached. It's always part of God's thought. That's the difference between thought and speech. Another difference is that when God creates everything, he uses his speech. How did he create the soul? When Adam is created, it says, Vayipach bi'apav, God blows in his nostrils a spirit of life. He doesn't say, let there be a person only. He says, I want to blow my energy into him. What's the difference between speaking and blowing? When you speak, there's air coming out of you. When you blow, there's air coming out of you. Unless you're in Washington, D.C., speech doesn't create that much air, as much as blowing. But in some places, there's a lot of hot air. So when God creates everything, it's his speech. It's a moderate energy. When you blow, you're coming from your gut. You're blowing from your very gut. You're giving your inner energy. That's the metaphor that's used. Obviously, God doesn't use physical blowing or speaking, but it's a metaphor that when God speaks, it's an external force of God. When God blows, it's internal. Now, what is the difference between external and internal? What do I mean by internal and external? One way of understanding that is from human behavior. There are a lot of things that we do because we want to do it, but it's external. You wanted to come to this class, so you went into your car. Is that why you came to the class so you can go into your car? Or did you go in your cars to come to the class? It's the latter, obviously. So going in your car is an external will. You don't really want to, if you had a way of flying over here without having to go in the car, you would fly. You go with a car because that's the only way you could transport yourself. What? Okay, and then we'll have to change the analogy. If you could just transport your atoms somehow. Yes. So you don't really want to go by the car. You don't want to do a lot of things. You don't want to go shopping, because some people do. You want the food. If you could get the food without shopping, and now you could do it. What is it called? Instacart.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Rabbi, when you were saying before you were differentiating voice from the air from your gut, is the air from your gut God's essence, or that's a deeper level?
Well, the Alter Rebbe doesn't go into the different levels. Yes, there's deeper and deeper and deeper. But relative to the air that comes out in speech, it's the essence.
The air that comes out in speech is essence?
No, relative to the speech air, the gut air is essence.
So when you read God's essence, that would include his air from his gut?
Yeah, that's what we mean here. In this, and on other places in Hasidus, it'll go into different levels, because even in internal there are different levels, just like there are different levels in external. For example, in external, you want to drive your car here to get here, but you had to go to the gas station to fill up your car with gas. So why do you want to fill up your car with gas? So you should be able to drive your car. Why do you want to drive your car? And then you can go on, there can be dozens of levels of external will till you come to your internal will. So that's the difference between everything else in existence. Yes, God wants it to exist. If God didn't want the table to exist, it simply wouldn't exist. But it's external will. The internal will, what is God really about? He's about that godly soul. Another analogy is the difference between a relationship of any one person to any other person, as close as it may be, and a relationship of a parent and a child. The relationship of the parent to the child is not one based on convenience, not based on benefits that you get from it. It's an essential relationship, and a healthy relationship, because there are some very sad cases where parents don't get along with their children, but where that isn't the problem. The parent's love for the child is not based on some consideration. Your relationship with your employer is based on the fact that he's paying your wages. And if he stops paying your wages for a while, then you may not be an employee anymore. Your relationship between your patient and a doctor is quid pro quo, but a parent-child relationship is an essential one. So our relationship with God, everything else has a relationship with God, but it's not an essential one. Our relationship with God is an essential one because of our godly soul. The Alter Rebbe uses an analogy that just like the child that's born from the father and mother, the father contributes the seed. The seed originates in the thought of the father, and that eventually develops in the womb of the mother and produces a child. So where does the child come from? The source, the ultimate source, is the brain of the father. And that's the way God refers to the Jewish people as you are children to God. Why is God calling us his children? We believe that every one of us is God's child. Why are we called his children? Because the metaphor of a child is that we derive from God's wisdom. The thought of the father, which produces the seed, that produces the fetus, originating in a person's thought, the same thing, our souls originate in God's thought. And God and his thought are one. He quotes Maimonides. Unlike humans, we have a person, and the person has a brain, hopefully, and the brain is used to learn a subject, which is a third entity. So when a person understands something, right now when you're listening, there are three different things going on, three different components. There's your intellect, and the subject. If you're missing any of those three, it's not a very good situation. You have to be a living being, and you have to have a mind, and you have to have a subject that you absorb. So God and his wisdom are really one, inseparable. God is not a composite. That's one of the meanings of when we say Shema and we say God is one. What does it mean that God is one? Does that mean that there are no two gods, no three gods? That's obvious. It means much more than that God is not a composite, that all of God's attributes are one with him. And therefore, when we say the soul comes from God's wisdom, just like the child ultimately traces himself back to the father's thought, that means that we are connected to God in a much more profound way. We're connected to God's essence, because God and his wisdom are one. So then how do we account for, oh yes.
So are we as Jews connected to God's essence, or are we as human beings?
Okay, you're asking, is there a difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? And the answer is yes. That doesn't mean that a non-Jew doesn't have a godly energy in him more than every other creature. But let me just explain. God created us with a purpose. In order to fulfill our purpose, we need the energy. If we don't have that purpose, we don't need the energy. You're not going to give a foot soldier the same information that you give to an officer or someone at a much higher rank. So if anyone wants to have the mission of the Jewish people, which is a mission that is unenviable, then they could convert to Judaism. If they choose not to, that's fine. But if they do convert to Judaism properly, and if they are born Jew or be born Jewish, that means they have a special mission for which they need a much more powerful godly energy, a much more overt, expressive godly energy. But anyone could have that soul if they want to become Jewish, and which means if they say, I want to become Jewish because Jews are lucky, they have better jobs and they're smarter and they make more money, and for those reasons, then obviously you don't want to be a Jew. You want to have the benefits, and the opposite of benefits outweigh the benefits, actually. But if you want to be a Jew because you want to adopt that mission, that means you have that soul, that special energy. So the question now becomes, okay, all souls originate with God's brain, God's wisdom, God's essence. So how come there are differences within souls? Not all souls are created equally. You have what is called head souls, like Moses, the patriarchs, the great leaders throughout Jewish history, and you have the toenail souls, the very low-level souls. What accounts for the differences? And the Alter Rebbe's answer is that's exactly the analogy of birth of a child. The child originates in the brain of the father, it's true, but you don't have a child without a mother. And the mother's and the seed gestating in the mother's womb for 9 months causes that initial seed to differentiate into different parts of the body. You have a brain, you have a heart, you have a lung, you have a kidney, and you have a toe and a toenail. They all come from the same source. And they're all really connected to the original source. How so? So the Alter Rebbe explains that in a human body, your toe is connected to your brain. If there's a severance between your brain and any other part of your body, then that part of the body atrophies. It can't really thrive. It has to be connected. So the Jewish people are like one body. So even the toenail Jew, even the Jew on the lowest possible level who gestated into a toe, is connected to the brain. And the brain of the child is connected to the brain of the father. It's the same concept. It's not the child doesn't develop into something different from the father's brain. The child can be smarter than the father, in fact. It doesn't have to be the same. Yes?
But Rabbi, it's disturbing because it seems what you're saying is that Judaism looks at the woman as nothing more than a vessel. But the child emanates from the father's...
No, in addition to the mother contributing her genetic material, the mother also takes the genetic material and gestates it and develops it and enables the body to turn into not just a brain, but an entire body with all different functions that work together in cohesion. So a woman does more than the man. The man just contributes genetic material. The woman, in addition to that, determines the full development of the child. So here's an interesting point that the Alter Rebbe makes. In the human body, the toe has to be connected to the brain. That means that in the scheme of the Jewish people, with all the different kinds of souls, the toe souls and everything in between has to be connected to the brain soul. And that's the reason why it says in the Talmud that, it says in the Torah, you're supposed to cleave to God. How do you cleave to God? By connecting to great sages, which means to holy people who are the brain souls. And that's the reason why throughout Jewish history, and especially in the Hasidic movement, people are very much connected to their leader, because by being connected to their leader, that's how they retain their connection to their original source. And what about people who don't feel connected? They still get the connection. They can't help it, but it's a lower level connection. But then there's another question over here. How come we find that there can be someone who is a very high soul, and yet they turn out to be very bad? They're born into a family of people who, let's put it this way: people come from a wonderful family, and they're born, and there's nothing special about them. And there's people who are born to a terrible family, and they're very special. So the Alter Rebbe develops an idea. The way I would like to explain it is, you have a godly soul and you have an animal soul. There has to be something that connects the two. There has to be communication. So So you could have the highest godly soul, you could have a brain soul, but it doesn't connect to your animal soul. There's no electricity going through. Why is that? Because there's a garment, the Alter Rebbe calls it a garment to your soul that is the intermediary between your godly soul and your animal soul. And that garment is determined by your parents. The type of soul that you have is not determined by anyone, it's determined by God. If God decides you're going to be a brain soul, you'll be a brain soul. If God decides you're going to be a kidney soul, you'll be a kidney soul. But if God decides you're going to be a brain soul, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to act like a brain soul. It could be you have tremendous potential, but the parents contribute the garment that creates the cohesion between the godly and the animal soul. Because if the godly soul and the animal soul don't speak to each other, it's like two people standing back to back to each other. That's the greatest gap between any two things. If you're 1,000 miles away, face to face, you're much closer than if you're back to back. You're touching each other because you're the whole world. The whole world is a gap between you. So you could have a godly soul and an animal soul, but if they are back to back, there's no communication, then the godly soul will not impact the animal soul. The animal soul will be very powerful. But if the person has the right garment, the right connection, then even if your godly soul is a very low level, you'll be very spiritual. That's why we find people, you ever wonder why a person could have a few children and one child is very spiritual and one is very non-spiritual? And you have these differences. What causes a person to be very spiritual? And the answer is, it could either be he has a very high soul, or it could be that the communication is very good. Communication between the godly and the animal soul is a very solid communication. So whatever spiritual level your soul has, whatever potential it has, is fully realized. But you could have the greatest and holiest soul, and you could turn out to be a horrible person. Why? Because the connection was not there. We find people like Jeroboam. Any of you remember him? Jeroboam lived at the time of King Solomon's heir, and he broke away from the land of Yehuda, Judea, and he took 10 tribes with him, and he erected temples with idols, and he became the most horrible person, one of the few people the Talmud says does not have a share in the world to come. He was a sinner and he caused others to sin. Yet he was a very holy, not holy, but very high level individual, very spiritual. He had a very high soul, but somehow there was some tension between his godly and his animal soul, so his animal soul dominated. And then you find people who were just average people and did heroic things. Why? Because even though their souls may have been very limited, simple souls, you could say, that doesn't mean that they couldn't achieve a lot, because their connections were very good. And that connection is not determined by God alone, it's determined by God and your upbringing, your parents, the parents' behavior and parents' upbringing as well. Okay, so now we've met the two souls. We have this animal soul and this godly soul. But let's define the godly soul. The godly soul, in chapter 3 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains, what is its composition? Its composition is two parts, intellect and emotion. And that's going to be very important in the subsequent chapters to understand that in order for us to have the right approach to life, we have to develop the right emotions. You know, if you ask the question, what's the more important, intellect or emotions? Your answer will be, of course, both. But what's the ultimate goal of a human being? A human being is compared to a tree. What's the most important part of a fruit-bearing tree? The fruit. But without the tree, there's no fruit. But the tree is the means to the end. The ultimate goal in Judaism is to get ourselves emotionally involved. And here's the difference between Chabad and the other Hasidic movements. The other Hasidic movements said, let's focus on the emotions straight away. That's what really is important. So let's get people emotionally involved in Judaism. by being in the presence of a holy Rebbe, being in the presence of many Hasidim, and the singing and the dancing and minimal Torah nuggets that are inspiring, because that's what gets the emotions excited. The Chabad system said, yes, you're right, the emotion is the most important thing, that people should get emotionally involved with their Judaism, but how do you get to the emotions in a way that it's not going to just be like you strike a match, there's fire, and then it extinguishes. You want it to remain there. It has to be part of you. So you need the intellect of the godly soul in order to create the right emotions. So the human being is made up of the godly soul, and we'll soon learn that the animal soul also has intellect and emotions. But the difference is that in the animal soul, it starts with emotion, and then it goes to intellect. How does an animal use its intellect? It uses its intellect in order to protect itself, to get food, to protect its offspring. The animal is basically an emotional creature, but it uses intellect. Sometimes animals are smarter than humans in certain areas. But the intellect serves the emotion. The godly soul, it works the other way around. The godly soul starts with intellect, with objective knowledge, objective truth, and the intellect creates the emotion. But intellect itself is divided into 3, and emotion is divided into 7. That's why we have the 10 attributes, 10 divine attributes. God also manifests himself through 10 attributes. 3 are intellectual, 7 are emotional. And our soul, which is a part of God, also mirrors those 10 attributes. And he goes, yes?
I just want to say, when I was in a lecture in Israel, in Jerusalem in 1994, Rabbi Vigilant taught that one of the most plain and simple ways in which God created man to govern his heart and his appetites and his reproduction is that the head is on top, it governs. On animals, your head is on the same plane as your genitalia, so that it's not meant to govern their appetites, but man is meant to master his appetites.
Right, I was going to go on to that a little bit, but so the intellect itself manifests itself in 3 ways, and those are called Chochmah, Binah, and Das, or Dat, the initials of which is Chabad. That's why Chabad is called Chabad, because it focuses on the intellectual faculties to use them as the means to produce the right emotional attachments. So what is the difference between Chochmah and Binah? Chochmah is the idea of conceiving of an idea. If once in a while a person will have a flash of insight, like a flash of lightning, and an idea becomes clear to you, but you can't explain it. It's just a certain sense of clarity. It's a kernel of knowledge. It's the germ. It's the seminal idea. Binah is where you develop the idea. You develop all of its component parts. You fully elucidate it. You elaborate on it. And in that way you can explain it to others. If you're only in the level of Chochmah, if you only have the concept in your mind, you can't explain it because it's just a seed. You look at a seed, you don't see a tree. Binah is with the development of the idea. So if a person has Chochmah and Binah, and if the godly soul, it means that you use it to understand God's greatness and God's relationship with us and God's attributes. And whenever you meditate on God, in a level of Chochmah you have the idea, and Binah you could develop the idea. That's like the father and the mother that will produce offspring. And what are the offspring? Emotions. What emotions? The primary emotions are ahava, love, and yira, which is translated usually as fear, but it means reverence and awe, respect. All forms of where you sense there's something bigger than yourself and you put yourself in your place. So how do you get to love and fear, love and awe? Through meditation. You have to meditate on God's greatness. If you don't meditate on God's greatness and you say, I love God, but God is an abstraction, how could you love an abstraction? The meditation makes God real to you. and it makes it real, you become conditioned to want to have a relationship with that God. If I tell you about a certain person, there's a certain person, his name is Yankl. I want you to love him. Who is Yankl? What about him? And I start telling you that he saved so many lives and he's so selfless. All of a sudden you have an appreciation. So you don't even know Yankl, but you already have an attachment, a good feeling about him, because you were exposed to the knowledge of that individual. Well, when you think about God and you learn about God, which is what Chassidus does a lot to supply us with this knowledge, you begin to develop a relationship, one relationship of love and another relationship of awe. You're in awe of God, and you feel insignificant, and you want to devote yourself to Him. You consider Him to be your master. So you serve God as a child who has love for his parent, and as a servant who has a sense of devotion, submission to his master. But then why do we need the third level, das? Das is translated as knowledge. Where do we find the word, form of the word used in the Torah? When it talks about Adam and Eve. And Adam knew Eve, which means he was intimate with her. Well, that's the intimacy element in knowledge. You could learn a subject, you could take a book out of the library, learn everything you want to know about that subject, but it doesn't relate to you. You're not attached to it. There's a third intellectual level, that's the bridge between intellect and emotion, where you're totally attached to the idea. You keep on meditating on it, you're focused on it over and over again, and you have an intent to internalize it. That's what das is, or dat, depending on your pronunciation. And that's what produces true emotions. If you don't have das, and you'll develop a feeling of love and fear, or reverence, it won't last. It's not real. Relatively speaking, it's better than nothing, but it's not really solid. To make something solid, it has to be an attachment. No matter how many times you learn about it, you never give up. You keep on attaching yourself to it. Those are the faculties of the soul. But then the soul has garments. And that's in chapter 4 of Tanya. The garments of the soul are the means through which the soul expresses itself. Just like a garment, you put on a garment, it tells you something about the person. If you're wearing a uniform with numbers on it, it tells you you're a football player. Defines you. Does it mean you're a good football player? Not necessarily, but it tells you something about the person. Now, could a person who's not a football player put on a football uniform? Sure. So it's not really, doesn't define you, it defines what you're doing. A person is dressed elegantly, formally, then they're probably going to a formal event. If a person is dressed in rags and torn clothing and reeking of alcohol, you know the person is probably a homeless alcoholic. Not necessarily. Someone could be dressed up that way. But usually garments are that which define you, but not define your essence, define your behavior, define your position in life. What work you do and what hobbies you have and so on. Well, when you take your godly soul and you invest it in the thought of Torah, in the speech of Torah or prayer, and the actions of the mitzvahs, then what are you doing? You're taking your soul and dressing it with thought, speech, and action that is divine. And that is what does to your soul something that your soul cannot do on its own. And let me try to explain. Your soul comes into this world, has to be tailor-made for this world. If the soul is so much beyond this world, it'll overwhelm you. So the soul goes through different gradations, and there's a prayer we say every morning. We say, the soul, God, the soul you put into me, Tahora, He is pure. You created it, you formed it, and you blew it into me. This describes the soul going through 4 levels. Each level reduces the power of the soul. It still retains godly energy, but it's godly energy that conforms to this world. When you use your thought, speech, and action for Torah and mitzvahs, that's one with God. That doesn't change. The same Torah that exists in God's thought is the same Torah that comes down into this world. The same mitzvah that is God's will manifests itself in this world. So when you put on the garment enhances you beyond your soul. It allows your soul to express itself, but even more than that, it adds to your soul a component that the soul doesn't have on its own. Because the soul on its own has to go through a gradual process of diminution. It's diminished. Its light is diminished. When the soul puts on this garment, it has much greater power, and it's like it envelops us with an aura of God's light that goes beyond anything any soul could achieve on its own. No matter how high the soul may be, the soul of the greatest person to ever live, Moses himself had to do a mitzvah. He couldn't say, look, I have the holiest soul of any human being. I'm superior to any person who ever lived. Why do I have to put on tefillin? Why do I have to do a mitzvah? Because as holy as his soul is, it had to go through a certain level to get into this world. Some souls have to go through more of a process of diminution, some less, but everyone has to go through that, and the mitzvah it elevates you to a higher level. And that's why the Alter Rebbe concludes chapter 4 that any mitzvah you do in this world is superior to what you're going to enjoy in paradise. Because in paradise, the soul is able to experience divine energy. But how much could a soul experience? It has a limit. Every soul has its limit. Where can you really grasp God? Where do you really attach yourself to God himself? Only here in this world when you do a mitzvah. In paradise, you can't do mitzvahs anymore. That's it. That's why the myth, Judaism doesn't talk about the afterlife, because it doesn't believe in an afterlife. That's nonsense. We do believe in an afterlife. But the reason why there's less focus on it is because where is it at? Where do you really get connected to God? In this world, by doing a mitzvah. In paradise, the soul doesn't have any more mitzvahs. It can't put on tefillin, it can't wear tzitzis, it can't light Shabbos candles, it can't eat kosher, it can't observe Shabbat, it can't do anything. It could just bask in the light. But how much light could you absorb? Every soul has its own limits. In this world, you're connected to God himself without any limits. No thought can grasp God except through observance of the mitzvahs. So that is the Alter Rebbe's way of describing the godly soul. It's a part of God. It consists of intellect and emotion, but it also has garments, and the ultimate goal is to put on those garments that not only protect us, as garments would do, from the elements. Garments have many functions. It beautifies us, it enhances us, it really connects us to God in a way that you cannot be connected. The soul can't be connected any other way comparable to the way it is through mitzvahs. Yes.
What does it mean when you say the soul, what you just said, the soul can't grasp God except through doing of a mitzvah?
Right. It only grasps what it's able to comprehend. The soul works with intellect and emotion. Intellect is limited. So even if you're the greatest intellect, you're limited, because intellect, by definition, is limited.
So how does it grasp God by doing a mitzvah?
The mitzvah, because it's God's will. God says you're connected to me when you do the mitzvah. Mm-hmm. The soul on its own can't be connected to God the way you're connected when you study Torah or do a mitzvah. Although there's a difference between study of Torah and mitzvah, which he goes into later.
But I'm doing mitzvahs all the time without consciousness of it.
That doesn't take away from the fact that you did the mitzvah. Unless...
But grasping is a mental function.
Grasping is an English word. Grasping means connecting to it. Intellect connects by understanding. But when you do a mitzvah, which doesn't require understanding, although understanding can enhance the mitzvah, you're connecting directly to God. If you want to say, I grasped God, not the intellectual sense of grasping, but holding on to something, You can only do it through a mitzvah. All the meditation in the world and all the spiritual energy that a person has in his soul will only be a limited connection to God. And that's when you put on the garment of mitzvahs, your soul is catapulted to a much higher level.
Torah is the blueprint for creation and the interface with the divine will, God's will. So when you absorb in Torah, you're interfacing with the divine will, and when you mentally absorb in...
Well, we're not talking about Torah itself, the study of Torah, that he discusses in the next chapter. We're talking about doing a mitzvah. Any mitzvah you do connects you. The word mitzvah comes from a root that means connection. Every mitzvah you do connects you directly to God, way beyond any possible level of your soul's comprehension of God. So whatever your soul could achieve on its own pales in comparison to what it can achieve when it puts on the garment of a mitzvah. Related to what you said before, the Hebrew word for king, melech, is an acronym. Mem stands for moach, brain. Lamed stands for lev, heart. And the chav stands for kaved, liver. That if you're only called a king, it means that you're in control when your mind is on top, as you said before. Your brain is higher up in the human being as opposed to an animal. You have a heart, symbol of emotion, and kaved is the organ that has the blood in it that represents the physical drives of a human being. That when is a person considered a king? When his brain controls the emotions which control the physical being of the person. If a person reverses that and the lev, the heart, the emotions come first, the word turns into lemech. Lemech was the name of a fool. And it's a Yiddish expression. If you're a lemech, you're a fool. That a person who allows his emotions to control him, to control his intellect, is like an animal, and for a human being to be like an animal is a symbol of his foolishness. Any questions? Yes?
So can you help reconcile, I might be misunderstanding or maybe conflating two separate concepts, but here it says the head soul and toe souls and everything in between, implying that certain people are heads, certain people are toes. But in another class, I'm not sure if it was here or somewhere else, the teacher said that it's up to each individual not to rely on a leader, but it's up to them to study and learn and forge their own spiritual...
Right, that's what I mentioned today and last week even more, that Chabad's emphasis was, as opposed to other Hasidic philosophies, that you can't rely on the Rabbi for your spiritual growth. That doesn't mean you're not connected and that you shouldn't be connected. It just means that you can't just say, let the Rebbe dabble in the higher spheres and I'll just do my basic stuff. Everyone has to strive on their own, but the connection has to always be there.
So no matter where they are in life or in the spiritual world, it's up to them to learn and to strive to... Right.
The way I presented it was that the other Hasidic groups, their Rebbes would teach, but their teachings were very short, concise, pithy, and they were geared to awaken the emotion of the Chassid. It was not intellectually grounded. I'm not saying that it didn't involve any intellect, but it was not a developed ideology and philosophy, because they believed very strongly, although that's changing these days, but that they believe strongly that you can't expect people to do things on their own on a high spiritual level. You have to get it from the Rebbe, and you should focus on the emotional attachment rather than the intellectual one. And it doesn't mean that they didn't believe in using your mind for study Torah. They reserved the study of Torah for Talmud, for biblical studies, but the Hasidus, the spiritual studies, they felt was only for the Rebbe, not for the average person. And Chabad disagreed with them very strongly that no, everyone has to strive on their own, intellectually, so that they develop their emotions, that becomes their emotions. It's not something that they're getting from someone else, or they're getting it on their own.
That's everything that the Baal Shem Tov stood for. It was that every Jew, simplest to exalted, every Jew counts, every Jew matters.
But Baal Shem Tov didn't focus on the intellectual approach. That was left for the Alter Rebbe.
He was saying that the simplest Jew's heart could penetrate through prayer higher than Rabbi.
Okay, that's another subject, that sometimes simplicity is a virtue. That's another totally unrelated subject, that sometimes a person who is simple, not by choice, if you're simple by choice, you're an idiot. If you're simple because of circumstances, that God put you in a situation where you didn't have the brain, or you didn't have the opportunity to learn, as happened in the days of the Baal Shem Tov, people were so crushed by the pogroms and by the anti-Semitism and by all the terrible things that were happening, that kids could never learn. And it developed a whole generation of very simple but ignorant Jews, and they were being castigated by many of the rabbis, blaming all the tragedies on the simple Jews. And the Baal Shem Tov couldn't tolerate that. And he says, no, on the contrary, you simple Jews, you're holier than the scholars, and you can reach higher levels, because you penetrate to the essence. That because your simplicity is not ignorance, your simplicity is purity. So that's a different angle. Yes.
Is that why you see some of the, I help with the outstretched arm at Tumble for Tzaddik, and is that why you see people with disabilities who just, when you get them in the show and they're doing stuff, that they have so much joy because they're connected at a different level, even though they can't intellectually connect?
Yes, there's a belief by many great rabbis that when you see a child born autistic, severely autistic, or other disabilities, that these are holy souls. That they're very special souls, and there's such a purity about them that parents should realize that they were entrusted. It's a special privilege. While no one should wish anyone to have a child that has severe disabilities, but once that happens, he should realize that this is a holy soul. Because sometimes simplicity is not a negative, it's a positive. But that's, again, if you choose simplicity, he says, I'm going to become as ignorant as I can possibly be. I'm never going to read, I'm never going to study, I'm never going to use my mind, because that's bliss. No, that's idiocy.